Before we start, just to lay some housekeeping rules. Please keep your phone on silent. There'll be mics going around. So please do ask questions, but try and keep them brief and maybe try and avoid long-winded opinions. So before I think we open the floor to questions, also you can post your questions on Slido. The code is Q797. You can also upvote them so that it goes to the top of the queue. So before we open the floor to questions from the audience, I have a question of my own. So, Dr. Razeen, you spoke about how Asia should transform if it is to truly embrace Schumpeterian capitalism. So my question to you is, in the next phase of global growth, which will very likely be led by technology, will capitalism survive that? And I ask this because with the invention of software and its ability to loop, it can essentially replicate all human behavior that's repetitive. And that's the case with most jobs, even a surgeon or an architect. And at the same time, I think it'll also create very large, dominant players like the Elon Musks of this world. So essentially, can capitalism survive that kind of economic model? And what does that mean for Asia, where its engine of growth has been, export-led? And especially countries like Sri Lanka, which is open, small open economies, what does that mean for them? I mean, obviously the impact will be very long-term, and I think it'll depend on politics. But it has been a factor for the political disruption that you are seeing in the West.
I think it's a fundamental question. That deserves to be asked. I am deeply skeptical of arguments that crop up every so often. This is not new, that what happened in the past you can completely forget about because everything in the future is going to be novel, and that economic history will essentially be upended. The record of the past is that industrial and technological revolutions have been creatively destructive in the Schumpeterian sense. They have destroyed a lot, including a lot of labor, which has been replaced by machines. But in the process, whole new sectors and industries have been created which were never predicted, which have created new jobs, some of them more productive and better paid than before. So the net labor effect has often been neutral, but we've seen a massive reallocation of resources in between. My gut instinct tells me that the future will not be that different to the past. So for all the modern buzz that we hear now about our new fourth industrial revolution technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, and what have you, having a net job displacement effect, I think are probably somewhat, perhaps very exaggerated. I suspect that in the future, we will see these technologies unfolding slowly or less slowly, but that they will create new spaces of economic activity, many of which we are not able to predict today, and that those will be labor intensive, particularly in services, maybe less so in manufacturing. I think the brunt of labor displacement is going to happen in manufacturing industries, but the churn that will create, I think will create a lot of opportunities, not just for infrastructure, which is labor intensive, but in lots of new services sectors, which will employ people across the wage and skill spectrum. And that will create opportunities in a different, more refined, more specialized division of labor for countries in these three Asian brackets I pointed to: rich, poor, and middle. That's my very broad answer. I don't think it's pre-programmed. Of course, a lot depends on the right sort of policies and institutions. But I mean, that sounds very abstract, but to put it in simpler, more tangible terms, things like self-driving cars, drone infrastructure, the use of artificial intelligence in lots of manufacturing industries is going to require a lot of infrastructure put in place. That will still need people. That's not going to happen automatically. And it will require new ecosystems of services, financial, legal, accounting, and whatever else, because of the transaction costs involved around these new industries with these new technologies. And all of that means people. It means jobs. Yes, I think there is a political and social issue here that's more important than in the past, because all of this is very disruptive within and between countries. Now, we had to worry about that less in the Industrial Revolution, the first one and the second one in the 19th century, because we lived in a world of autocracies and people had to adjust. Now we live in a world of some part of the world in democracies, and of course in a world of much speedier communications and greater expectations. So there's perhaps more opposition within countries, and maybe particularly in the more advanced countries, to a lot of this disruption, which can easily make political systems more unstable and lead to populist outbursts like we see now in the United States and Europe. And that can upset, if you like, a political or social compact to enable this disruption to happen in the future. So far, that's been a Western phenomenon, not so much a phenomenon in other parts of the world. We might see it become more a phenomenon in the rich part of Asia, in particular in years or decades to come. So I think it's all open. Of course, I'm speculating wildly, but I would be very wary of prognostications of a kind of apocalyptic future whereby machines displace people and we have the end of Homo sapiens as we know it.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Can we have
My name is Dr. Zulfik. It was a very interesting lecture, Professor. In fact, now about Sri Lanka's economy, at the moment we are very
Sorry, would you hold your...
very badly hit. So can we make Sri Lanka economy maybe by the now it's about 3 years, now the new government has taken over. Can we make it by 220 or 225 to make, and whether can we go as a Sri Lanka, as Asia's economy hub of Asia, maybe by 10 years. Now you see, now I'm very happy that we have got a new governor, that is Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy. He is a better person than Arjuna, but still he is still missing. I'm sorry to say that. Where the Prime Minister says that he doesn't want to actually protect rogues, but we find there are still rogues are there, but his father also was involved in one of the frauds. But I feel people like you, Professor, should be in our team. You know, if we can form a team, a strong economic team, so Sri Lanka could be benefited. So I propose that if you also come and help us, Sri Lanka, chairing the team, it will be much better. So that is what I just wanted to see, how we can march forward the economy of Sri Lanka?
Thank you for your flattering comments. Many people in Sri Lanka vastly overestimate my influence here, which in reality is very limited. I can assure you. Do you have a specific question you'd like me to address?
How can Sri Lanka, now when the things are going on like this, we can't move forward. So what I want is we need a good economist to advise the government. That is what we need, at least a good team.
Well, you know, one thing I've learned, not least in the last few years of policy advice.
So how do you overcome all this?
Is, I mean, when it comes to people, personnel, I think there's perhaps too much of a tendency to look for the, you know, the white man with a brand behind him to come here and give advice. I mean, I know, let's say, a critical mass of very good local economists and professionals who I think have the right set of ideas, which they've been trying unsuccessfully so far to translate into government policy. I think, yes, it's important to have a good core group of people to push the reforms through, a combination of people of different expertise, you know, your bonehead economists, plus experienced practical people, particularly who can think about how to implement the thing. And Sri Lanka has been missing that, particularly on the implementation side. For Sri Lanka to get out of its present rut, to come closer to achieving its potential, requires long-range reforms which are not possible at the moment, but I think, you know, there is a core of priority short-term reforms that are achievable. It starts with having a stable fiscal policy, monetary policy, and exchange rate. I agree with you that Dr. Kumaraswamy, at the helm of the central bank, has done a successful job in very difficult circumstances in trying to restore some sort of stability to the economy. With the backing of this IMF program. But beyond that, I think, is a story of failure. Goodness knows we need a bonfire of regulations domestically to unleash those entrepreneurial energies. So far, that's not happened. We have one of the most protected economies in Asia, if not the world, which needs significant liberalization. That's not happened either. So you have an economy that's still very hierarchical and dominated by a small set of cronies who get along very well with the previous lot and with the present lot, and I'm sure with the future lot. And that screws most ordinary Sri Lankans. So it's not rocket science. I think, you know, the policies are out there. It's just that the government itself, its principles haven't articulated a coherent vision, and they haven't championed those policies. And that's a dereliction of leadership. So we need to find a way out of that. The odds are that it won't happen. The reform window is either closing or has already closed. It's going to be very difficult to do anything serious between now and the next elections. And because the government isn't fighting this battle, its principles aren't fighting this battle, none of them, I think it's all the more important for Advocata and the like-minded to fight that battle, you know, for the short term and the long term.
Professor, sorry, one more question. Can't we get some investors? We need more investors to come into Sri Lanka. Then it'll be better. We can get the economy up.
Maybe we can
Thank you.
take this offline.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can we get a mic here, please?
Hello, my name is Kitsri Vijayasundara. I like to ask, I'm an engineer. I was very motivated by the question Eshini asked because the disruptive technological change that is happening elsewhere in the world, fourth industrial revolution is coming. So already we have lost a lot due to whatever the political and administrative maladministration we have had in the past, during our lifetime actually. So how do we catch up? Now, assuming out of the three scenarios you forecasted, the most optimistic one takes place. Assuming that happens in political and administrative scenario, should we go in for a accelerated strategy to get into fourth industrial revolution industries into this country with necessary educational and TVET reforms and by having an aggressive program? What do you think? Will it work?
Well, let's play with that. My most optimistic scenario of, if you like, a continued Pax Americana, which I think would be the best enabling environment for doing the right things at home. Whatever fancy stuff that we might consider doing in Sri Lanka, we can't overlook the basics. It starts with the basics. Macroeconomic stability, having more competition domestically, opening up to international trade and investment. That's, if you like, the short-term list of priorities, first-generation reforms, so-called. And we can't even get that right. We have to get that right before even thinking of the fancier stuff, because that's really the enabling platform for everything else. But to move to really fully take advantage of what's coming around the corner probably requires going into those deeper structural reforms that I mentioned earlier, and which you also mentioned. It's difficult to see Sri Lanka really taking advantage of these new technologies with the education system it has, with the lack of vocational training, with a very low science base, given its deficiencies in hard and soft infrastructure. But these policies, I mean, firstly, they're not politically feasible at the moment. But even if they were, take time to unfold and bear fruit. But I mean, to cut a long story short, I would put it this way. I am generally more a fan of horizontal economy-wide policies, where I think a halfway decent government has a better chance of getting things right than policies which target particular sectors. Now, it might be too simplistic to make such a rigid distinction, but I think our main imperatives here are to get those basics right, which are all about horizontal policies that affect every sector of the economy, not just this sector or that sector. And even beyond the more structural reform type of policies, to target policies that have an economy-wide effect. Now, going beyond that, should we target particular technologies? Should we target particular industries for domestic promotion and for foreign investment? I'm not a fan of hard targeting because I think for the most part it's not succeeded around the world. There may be some examples here or there where it has, but for the most part I think it hasn't, for predictable reasons. Governments are not competent enough. There's too much rent-seeking, there's too much corruption, there's too much capture by the favored business groups. It may leave some room for soft targeting. I mean, Duminda Arya Singer is here from the BOI. I mean, in his day-to-day job, inevitably he has to make decisions about, I mean, he can't target every single industry and every single multinational under the sun, but he has to be selective. Those are decisions at the margin. But I would caution against hard industrial policy where you target particular sectors in a really hard way. Maybe you give them all sorts of special incentives, tax holidays. We've been there in Sri Lanka, and we've got our fingers burnt. It's not a good idea to go back in that direction, much as some people in government would like to go back in that direction, and thereby undermine the very Inland Revenue Act that's recently been passed. Because I don't think any of us, whether in government or elsewhere, have the ability to predict the future in that way. We think we have. That's a fatal conceit, as Friedrich Hayek once put it. And then all sorts of messy politics gets involved along the way. And the world in itself has become so much more complicated to plan in such a way. I mean, that's my long roundabout answer. It's, if you like, a skeptical economist's answer, an economist who believes much more in biological analogies than analogies from mechanical physics, which is why I'm usually very skeptical of engineers when they make policy pronouncements. But nothing personal intended. Let me hasten to it.
Thank you very much, but please give me an opportunity to ask one more question, having answered this first question. That is about, now the other option is actually, now we are talking about Colombo to Trincomalee economic corridor, and already ADB is working on that plan. So when such a thing comes, what should be the industries we should focus on? Because anyway, they are looking at developing human skills to match or to gainfully implement that industrialization program. So in that, should we look in for Michael Porter's theory and look at competitive advantage of nations and try to develop labor force? We are talking about the economic factors. Labor force into something which is superior in our competitive other countries, because we have already lost in this run. We have lagging behind most of the neighboring countries.
I mean, I wouldn't overcomplicate this. I think, and one has to be realistic. I don't think we are in a position to leapfrog relevant comparator countries. And of course, talk in Sri Lanka has historically been very loose and cheap and has not resulted in success. I think there are many things to fix which still involve catching up with the mean or with better practice. And that includes education and training here. That would be, if you like, my initial stab at an answer. Again, when one talks about these industrial corridors, I think if we can get some of those basics right, we will attract clusters of industries, not so much in manufacturing, but in services niches. And it probably starts with a big improvement in a logistics infrastructure and Sri Lanka's connections, maritime and otherwise, with the outside world. And then other things will plug in. So on the macro scale, I would be reluctant to do that kind of specific targeting. When you're talking about particular industrial parks or particular zones, then yes, you have to make decisions about sectors and industries. But those are more micro decisions rather than the macro decisions that affect the broad economic aggregates.
Thank you.
I think just to add to that, something that Germany, I think, has done well is they've invested a lot in vocational training and also in R&D. In Asia, I think it's been quite limited how much governments invest in R&D. And I think the multiplier effect is a lot more than when the private sector invests. I don't know if
It's
that's
not-
something that can...
But that's not the US record. The US, of course, invests heavily in R&D, and yes, there is a public role, not least through the Pentagon, the Defense Department, but it's predominantly private sector led, and a lot of the relationships created, for example, between universities and companies, are private sector led. And as the data shows, I showed one chart up there, the United States is still the leader in terms of world levels of productivity. I think people talk about quantities, percentage of spending relative to GDP on basic and applied research. Yes, that might be important up to a point. I think what's equally or perhaps more important is the quality of R&D, which depends very much on your institutional base. Now, the lesson to draw from Germany, and by the way, the German story is very mixed. The German story is one of success in some manufacturing industries, but compared with other economies in the West, of failure in most services industries. Germany really lags in many services sectors. But where it has succeeded in niches in manufacturing, the record of success is very much due to the kind of very peculiar institutional mix that Germany has, the kind of cooperation it has between its unions, its industry associations, its vocational training institutes, the kind of two-tier vocational training system where you actually study and you work on the job, their apprenticeship system. That's arguably much more important than the quantum of money spent on R&D. But those are very difficult systems to replicate elsewhere. It's not as if you can take that and automatically transplant it here in Sri Lanka or elsewhere.
So there's a question on Slido. To give some context. So I think we are in an era, it could be that we are in an era where peak globalization is behind us and we're actually retreating now. And you have a world order which is more multipolar. And with that, in an environment like that, how should Sri Lanka's foreign policy be, and how should Sri Lanka kind of approach globalization and exports?
I really don't have anything to add to what I said before in my comments about what Sri Lanka's foreign policy should be. We may or we may not have had peak globalization. I think, again, there's a choice out there. There's a battle to be fought. I don't think it's pre-programmed. We may head in the direction of a kind of reversal, creeping or otherwise, of globalization, more protectionism. That's the way it looks at the moment, but that's just at the moment. We may be in the beginnings of a decisive power shift. Again, I don't think that's pre-programmed. Again, another battle to be fought. But wherever we are heading, in these very uncertain waters, with misty fog ahead of us, my recipe for Sri Lanka's foreign economic and foreign security policies is to have balance. And not to be too dependent on one country in particular, and the country I'm most worried about is China. So yes, of course, we cannot afford to antagonize China too much, but at the same time, we shouldn't be China's brown noses. We shouldn't be constantly sniffing China's backside. Just as some business people here sniff the backsides of politicians who they think are going to become the next rulers. We need to cultivate our relationships with others on economic, political, and security grounds. And as I said, two particular others, the United States and India, because even if the United States is going to is in decline, it is not going to go away. It's still too big and powerful for that for the foreseeable future. And it is still the cradle of the world's innovation. India is not going to go away because it's our giant neighbor, and it's the sub-regional power. And those are bored realities we have to deal with as best we can.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name is Shahan De Silva. Looking at the land productivity in Sri Lanka, it seems to be that we are, there's a lot more headroom there for growth. So I would suggest that we're in phase one, in that sweat era, as opposed to the more innovation-led growth stage, which is stage two. So some of the examples of how nations came out of that phase is the Korean example. And similarly, in the not too distant past, the American examples of GM, Airbus, Boeing, etc., of state patronized, it's a public-private institute, as it were. Now, that seems to have worked for these countries to get out of that phase one stage to start thinking about phase two. So if we were to use, what's your opinion of using the Marx-Mao as a phase one model and to go to transition into a Schumpeter-like model as a phase two method, if you will?
Well, I mean, that's a very useful question. Let me deconstruct it a little bit, being the academic bonehead. I think what you were describing was not so much a Marx-Mao model, but a Listian model of capitalism for phase one, before moving to phase two. And I think what you're attributing to a successful phase one is, if you like, successful hard industrial policy, where you selectively target particular sectors, you protect them against foreign competition as your infant industries, you subsidize them, maybe you have some competition on the domestic market, and then when infants grow into adults and can compete on the world stage, you take the protection away, and hey presto, you end up with Boeing, Samsung, Cisco, Nissan, Toyota, and others. I would dispute that attribution. I think it's full of holes. Let me try and do it in a nuanced way. I think if you think of America in the 19th century, or America more recently, where America has had economic success has been primarily due to sort of getting those basics right and improving the structure of the American economy to boost competition and productivity. So my takeaway from that real productivity burst in the United States, its Goldilocks years in the 1990s, up until the GFC, is not so much about financial engineering, but it's about reforms that Jimmy Carter reluctantly started, and Ronald Reagan really took and followed through it, as did George Bush, as did Bill Clinton to some extent. It wasn't about Boeing versus Airbus. That was a sideshow in comparison. So industrial policy stories, I don't think were responsible for American success recently, nor indeed in the 19th century pre or post-bellum. It had a lot to do with an integrating domestic market with huge economies of scale and scope, which created those very big firms that innovated and led creative destruction, much more than any government-led industrial policy. As for the East Asian tigers, starting with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, I mean, those are the three main examples used. And in that period from the 1950s to the 1970s, I think that's the more mixed story. Yes, there was hard industrial policy, particularly in South Korea. Yes, I think you can point to some examples of success. You have to ask the question, would we have Samsung today or Cisco or others today if not for their very deliberate promotion by President Park in the 1960s and the 1970s in particular? Still, I think I would still argue that Korea, Taiwan, Japan wouldn't be where they are today if not for getting those basics right. And then with industrial policy, there are some successes, but there are also some failures. And those successes have bred the problems of today. The Korean economy today, part of rich Asia, has a productivity problem. It has a rent-seeking problem. It has a political system problem. It has an SME problem because of those very chaebol that were created by President Park in the 1970s. Not least, those were conditions that led to financial excess and the Korean crisis that forced them to call the IMF in the late 90s. So I think it's a very mixed tale. What are the lessons for a country like Sri Lanka? I think very few, possibly zero, for several reasons. I think, firstly, because I think the industrial policy success story of the East Asian tigers and others has been vastly exaggerated, while overlooking the getting the basics right story, which is, I think, the main lesson we have to learn. Secondly, because even if there was industrial policy success in these countries, it required a certain capacity in government and a certain cohesion in society, which we simply do not have in Sri Lanka, nor are likely to have for the foreseeable future. In other words, it simply won't work with our politics and economics and society. The third reason is this. This so-called developmental state model that people talk about regarding the East Asian tigers was in a different world. It was in a world before today's world of global supply chains, where you had discrete industries, where you had all production in one country for export. And then countries traded with each other. Now we are in a much more splintered world of fragmented production, with also a much bigger services component. And the future is much, much more about services than it is about manufacturing, especially in the middle income and upper income parts of the world. And those industrial policy recipes, with their recipes for government planning, I think are much, much less relevant in this kind of world, because it's much more kaleidoscopic, it's much more difficult to plan, it's much more difficult to find your niche, it's much more difficult to protect against outside competition if you want to bring those global value chains in. And it's much more difficult to plan your services future the way some countries thought they were planning their industrial future. So those are the reasons I would give against going down that road.
I would like to suggest that some of the US policy was driven as a post-World or during a World War II phase where there was a military requirement for some of these institutions as well. Hewlett-Packard, IBM, some of the giant mature companies right now developed within that stage. So even though there might not have, I would like to suggest that there wasn't a concerted government restructuring as opposed to a market developed to serve this war effort.
Yeah. But granted, you're referring to some companies, but then there are a host of others that emerged post-bellum, from the end of the Civil War to the early 20th century, and then others during the interwar period, that had nothing to do with World War-like conditions, just as the present wave of American companies, of course the Fortune 100 or 500 list looks completely different to what it did just a generation ago. They have emerged out of nowhere and risen to the top in conditions of peacetime, in a globalizing world economy, and with little or no direct government support. Of course, I'm thinking of the Googles and the Facebooks of this world. So, you know, the high-tech, big-tech success in the United States we see at the moment is difficult to attribute to these kinds of industrial policy, whereas China, of course, now has a rival model of the government deliberately supporting companies, you know, behind a wall of protection for the success of the future. And I have my doubts about success in the future.
The question is about the brain drain. I mean, people are talking about brain drain from Sri Lanka. About roughly 10% of skillful, economically productive Sri Lankans living outside Sri Lanka at the moment. You are one of them. And how will be a meaningful repatriation program from whatever we speak about, the diaspora or non-residential Sri Lankans? How will impact on our economic salvation?
Well, I keep saying get the basics right. I think this, again, it goes back to those simple verities. The diaspora comes back for seasonal holidays and perhaps some of them to retire and invests in holiday homes, but not in factories and jobs and services outlets. If we got those basics right, even a third or 50% or 2/3, I think we would automatically attract much more of the diaspora back for productive activities that would reverberate through the economy. With back to those horizontal policies. Now, so I think that's where we need to start, because without that, the incentives aren't there. Now, on top of that, there may be useful flanking policies, and we can look at good practice abroad to attract diasporas back. Passports, or the equivalent of a Sri Lankan passport, setting up, operating bank accounts. Now, as a non-resident Sri Lankan, I have dual nationality, but all I'm entitled to at the moment is a non-resident account, which is hedged with all sorts of restrictions. That shouldn't be the case. So, there are flanking policies, but I think the essence is to get those basics right, or to begin to get them right. And then Sri Lanka will have happen what's happened elsewhere, what we've seen with the Chinese diaspora, to some extent with the Indian diaspora, or with the Vietnamese diaspora.
Yeah. My question is, post-Second World War, there was a Marshall Plan which was primarily driven by interest in the rise of USSR, and I think Western Europe seriously benefited out of it. So when you're referring to India and China and the West competing in Sri Lanka, my question is whether the government of Sri Lanka can strategically leverage the situation to its economic advantage. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Sri Lanka needs a Marshall Plan like a hole in the head. The Marshall Plan worked as a complement to European governments getting their act together post-World War II, led by Ludwig Erhard and the German economic miracle, in very specific Cold War circumstances. I mean, as you said, General Marshall, as Secretary of State, sold it to the Congress as a way of preventing Western Europe from being overtaken by Soviet communism. We don't have those specific circumstances here. And Sri Lanka already probably has too much aid, with so many competing aid agencies coming here, with perhaps too much government attention, this government's attention and previous government's attention, going to getting aid packages, with the whole circus and industry that goes around it. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any aid in Sri Lanka. Some of my free market friends are at that purist end of the spectrum. But the last thing Sri Lanka needs is a much bigger program of aid, which would fuel much more corruption and rent-seeking, and be a distraction from the very real choices that we need to make here at home. In that sense, aid really is a curse. And that's also one danger of being too dependent on China. There is largesse from there. Aid and, of course, debt at commercial rates of interest. But we shouldn't be going down that route. We shouldn't be looking for foreign saviors. The answers do very much lie at home. And as I said before, it's not rocket science. It's just very difficult politically and institutionally.
Do you think the economic liberation in China will propel the population to demand political liberalization eventually?
Yeah, that's eventually perhaps. You know, the conventional thinking in the West, you know, very much with in the wake of winning the Cold War, was that China's economic opening would, in linear fashion, lead to political liberalization. Maybe not full Western-style democracy, but moving somewhat in that direction. And China's entry to the WTO was seen very much in that broad context in the West, and particularly by the Clinton administration. As we know now, it hasn't turned out that way. So China liberalized and then stopped liberalizing about a decade ago, and has reversed somewhat with its industrial policy. Now, I don't know what the future will look like in China 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, but all I suspect is that the tensions and the contradictions in China are only going to get worse. So I think that combination of Maoan markets is inherently unstable and perhaps ultimately unviable. Because on the economic and social side, people are freer in China. They have more expectations. There is a bigger middle class. There are little local revolts here and there, which haven't translated into any kind of national revolt. But this jars with the inbuilt conservatism of its political system and increasing authoritarianism. I just feel that there's more of a clash coming between the two. Now, Robert Kaplan, who's a very well-known American writer and commentator, Romanian extraction, I think, writes almost a book a year. His latest book, which came out just a few months ago, is called Marco Polo's World. And he made the prediction 20 years ago when others were predicting the end of history and the march of Western liberal democracy around the world, that the future would be of authoritarianism, of the rise of China and India as autocracies and successful autocracies on the Eurasian landmass. That was 20 years ago. In his present book, if I read the reviews rightly, I haven't read the full book yet, he makes the prediction that these autocracies are going to fail. They're going to fail because of their inherent contradiction between their politics and economics. They're trying to be globalized market economies, but at the same time, they're autocracies which are becoming more repressive, China and Russia. Sorry, not India, Russia. And the resolution of this tension is not going to be liberal democracy, but more instability and perhaps disorder in a kind of vacuum on the Eurasian landmass, and that spells trouble for us all. Right? So that is perhaps one very negative scenario to bear in mind.
Let me just ask this final question before we wrap up. You speak about crony capitalism as, characteristic of Asia. But generally, if you think of the private sector, while they've been the engine of innovation, they also exploit. Especially when they become large firms or large industries such as the banking and finance sector, energy, pharmaceuticals, and now even tech, because they have significant economic rents. And that means that they basically lobby politicians to implement policies that benefit them. So, but if you look at Schumpeterian capitalism, it very much champions individualism, startups, and it's no longer a level playing field. The economic model where the fittest survives doesn't really happen. And a lot of people feel disenfranchised. And I don't think it just happens in Asia, it happens around the world. Is that an economic reality that we have to accept? Just like we've accepted that there'll be booms and busts in the economy? Or are there things that governments and the private sector can do to minimize this?
I don't think it's preordained. It's a reality. I don't think it's a reality that the most innovative firms are the most protected firms. I think it's quite the opposite. The most protected firms are generally the least innovative firms because they don't have the incentive to innovate. They're comfortable with their rents. And they keep the innovators out. And by the way, that's true in political markets as much as it is in economic markets. So I think what you can draw from Schumpeter's work is that the system needs to be sufficiently open for creative destruction to happen. Because in a closed system, creative destruction doesn't happen. The incumbents just stay there and they ossify, but they can't be toppled. So you have to find ways of prizing the system open or introducing entry points for potential competitors. That's the challenge in both politics and economics. It's very difficult. It's difficult enough in the West, but those institutional challenges, I think, are that much bigger in countries, in societies like ours.
Okay, I think with that, we'll wrap up the Q&A. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.